This video is an exam paper walkthrough of the 2022 Paper 1 exam paper. I'm going to divide this up into 4 videos, one video for each of the 4 sections of the exam. In this first video I'll give you an overview of the paper with some general tips and advice for Paper 1, and then at the end of the 4th video I'll summarise some of the key lessons and takeaways from the whole paper. Paper 1 contains 4 sections and they are always in the same order. Section A is social influence, Section B is memory, Section C is attachment, and Section D is psychopathology. Each section is worth the same 24 marks and the exam is 2 hours long, so that means you have 30 minutes for each section. Each section is designed to assess you on a range of skills that include AO1, which is your knowledge and understanding, how accurately can you describe and outline theories and studies. AO2, how well can you apply your knowledge to the scenario given to you in an exam question. And AO3, how well can you evaluate and discuss theories and studies. Now before we dive into the first section, one thing you might want to do is have a quick flick through the exam paper at the very start of the exam. Firstly, look to see how many essay questions there are. Sometimes there are a number of 16-mark essays, or there might be a number of 8-mark questions. It's helpful to look at the essay questions at the start, as it gives your mind time to think about and recall what you might put in that question. Some essays might be slightly harder than others, and you might not be able to recall the information straight away, so having a look at it at the beginning gives your mind a chance to recall any of the information, and you can simply jump to it during the exam and make a quick note before you come to answer it later. The second reason to flick through the paper is to look for research methods questions. Now just in case you're not aware, you might be thinking that research methods isn't on paper 1, it's on paper 2, and you would be correct. It's section C on paper 2. However, a few research methods questions actually appear in all 3 papers, and when they appear in paper 1, they usually appear in one of the 4 sections. So let's flick through the paper now and see what we notice. For social influence, there is a 16-mark essay on obedience. For memory, there is another 16-mark essay on the working memory model with application. For attachment, there's a 16-mark essay on animal studies, and for psychopathology, there's an 8-mark question on explaining OCD. So here we can see that we have a lot of essays to write, so we need to be strict with ourselves about timing. We can also see as we got to the psychopathology section that this is where the research methods questions were, and there were 3 of them related to statistical tests. Now that we have this overview of the paper, we can now explore the first section, social influence. For each question, I recommend annotating it to help you carefully take note of what the question involves. At the basic level, you're looking for the command word, the topic, and the marks. So pause the video, have a read of question 1, and if you have a copy of it in front of you, annotate it and have a think about what you can remember and write about. I'll put a pause sign on the screen for each question to remind you to have a go yourself each time. Question 1 says, which factors affecting minority influence are illustrated by the following examples? For each example, write the correct factor in the space provided, 3 marks. So here the topic is minority influence and there are 3 marks. So 1 mark for each example. If we zoom out of the social influence topic, we'll remember that there are 3 sections, conformity, obedience and resistance. And minority influence fits in the resistance section with the work of Moscovici. Minority influence is how a small group, a minority, can bring about change and influence the majority. The reason why I'm thinking like this is because I'm using categorization and cues to help my recall of the information. For more on this, check out the video I'll link above and in the description. The factors affecting minority influence are consistency, commitment and flexibility. With this in mind, let's look at each example. Members of a religious group give up their Saturday mornings to distribute leaflets about the importance of worship. Well, this sounds like commitment. An environmental group acknowledges that recycling can be time-consuming while emphasising its importance for the future of the planet. Well, this sounds like flexibility. And all of the members of the Flat Earth Society agree that the Earth is flat and not round. Well, that sounds like consistency. Question 2. Name one explanation of resistance, 1 mark. Command word here is name, so you simply state the name of the explanation. There's no need to provide any more information. Don't waste your time describing it when it just says name. There are 2 explanations. One is situational, known as social support, and the other is dispositional, which is called locus of control. So here you would write one of those 2. Question 3. A teacher was absent and left work for students to complete during the lesson. Some students in the class did not do the work their teacher had left for them. Use one possible explanation of resistance to social influence to explain why this happened. 4 marks. Now this question has more going on. Firstly, the command words are explain why this happened, and secondly, the topic is explanation of resistance, but we're only allowed to use one and it's worth 4 marks. This question requires AO1, knowledge of the explanation, and also AO2, application to the scenario. So it's helpful to think about breaking those 4 marks down into 2 marks for AO1 and 2 marks for AO2 to help you write a good answer. The 2 explanations of resistance are social support and locus of control, as we just saw in the previous question. So for an answer for locus of control, we might write something like this. Locus of control is a dispositional explanation of resistance that puts the emphasis on the personality of the individual. An internal locus of control is where the person believes they are able to control what happens to them. In contrast, an external locus of control is where the person believes that they have no or little control over what happens to them. People are more likely to resist with an internal locus of control. In the scenario, those students in the class who did not do the work their teacher had left them may have had an internal locus of control. They decided whether to complete the work rather than the teacher. In contrast, you could have written about social support. Social support is a situational explanation of resistance that puts the emphasis on external factors. It states that people are more likely to resist if they are in the presence of others who disobey. They act as role models, increasing resistance. Applying this to the scenario, we can see some students did not do the work. They acted as role models to the other students and made it easier for them to disobey too. The mark scheme for this question would also allow you to make reference to studies to illustrate this. So for locus of control, you could describe Holland's research with Milgram's participants who refused to go up to 450 volts, with many of them having an internal locus of control. Or for social support, you could reference Milgram's variations, where he included a dissenter, someone else in the room with the participant who refused to administer the electric shocks. The result being obedience rates dropped. Now we come to the essay. Question 4 reads, describe how situational variables have been found to affect obedience. Discuss what these situational variables tell us about why we obey. 16 marks. The command words are describe and discuss. This is a typical essay question with 6 marks for AO1 and 10 marks for AO3 evaluation. The first part of the question is quite straightforward. Situational variables refer to the external factors that influence obedience. They relate to Milgram's research into obedience and his variations, specifically proximity, uniform, and location. For 6 marks, we would describe each one, thinking about getting 2 marks for each. So for proximity, we could write about when the teacher and the learner were in the same room and how obedience decreased from 65% to 40%. In the touch proximity condition, the teacher had to force the learner's hand onto the electric shock plate when they refused to answer a question, and obedience decreased from 65% to 30%. And when the experimenter left the room and gave instructions via the telephone, obedience rates dropped from 65% to 20.5%. For uniform, we could write about how in the original study the experimenter wore a grey lab coat like a scientist, but in this variation Milgram had the experimenter dressed as an ordinary member of the public in everyday clothes, and as a result the obedience rate dropped from 65% to 20%. And for location, we could write about how originally Milgram conducted the research at Yale University, but when carried out in a rundown office block, obedience dropped from 65% to 40%. The AO3 part is a little trickier. This is because it says discuss what situational variables tell us about why we obey. At this point, it's worth reading the examiner's report on this question. It stated, discussion should have focused on what research into situational variables has told us about why we obey, but many answers diverted into evaluating the work of Milgram. This was creditable where there were links to the question, but detailed accounts of, for example, ethical issues rarely earned marks. This is a good example of answering the question set rather than the question you want to answer. So what are the reasons why people obey, and how can we discuss this? Well, we're more likely to obey people in uniform because they are seen as a legitimate authority. Their uniform reflects a social hierarchy where they are higher and have status and power. Location is also more likely to make people obey if that location communicates a legitimate authority, which can be conveyed through the association of a prestigious and highly academic university. To discuss this, we can then evaluate Milgram's research into situational variables. Now be careful here. Take a look at the examiner's comment again. Many answers diverted into evaluating the work of Milgram. This was creditable where there were links to the question. If you are going to evaluate Milgram's research in this question, which I would encourage you to do, you need to make sure your evaluation is about the question, about situational variables. Evaluation that is just about Milgram is not relevant to the question unless you make it relevant. So we could criticise what Milgram found about situational variables because it lacks ecological validity and it lacks population validity. These two problems undermine the situational variables explanation because the evidence on which it's based lacks generalizability for those two reasons. Now, to produce some higher level evaluation at this point, you could then throw in a counter-argument using the research of Bickman. Bickman conducted a field experiment in a much more ecologically valid setting of New York City. People were much more likely to obey a guard in uniform than a milkman or someone dressed in normal clothes. For a third evaluative point, we could talk about how the extent to which situational variables affect obedience can be influenced by culture. Mantell replicated Milgram's study in Germany and found higher obedience rates, whereas when Killam and Mann replicated the study in Australia, they found lower obedience rates. And for a final evaluative point, which also potentially scores higher, would be to compare it with another explanation. This is because the obedience rate up to 450 volts in Milgram's study was not 100%, which suggests other factors must be involved. The opposite explanation of the situational explanation is the authoritarian personality, which puts the focus on the individual. Perhaps some people are more likely to obey because they have a personality type that makes them more likely to respect people superior to them and look down on people who are inferior to them. Research by Elms and Milgram found that those participants who were more likely to obey up to 450 volts were more likely to have an authoritarian personality. So that completes section A. In the next video, we'll go through the memory section. I hope you found this video helpful, and we'll see you in the next one.